John Harris always started his day the same way, rising with the crack of dawn, pouring himself a steaming cup of coffee, and quietly sitting on the porch of his modest home before the rest of the world stirred awake. His wife, Emily, usually peeked out from the kitchen with a teasing smile, always saying the same thing. "You love your coffee more than me, don't you, John?" It was their little inside joke, one that always earned a warm chuckle from him and a playful kiss on the cheek before he left for work. Life was simple, predictable, and John liked it that way. He took pride in his job as a security guard at Greenway Plaza Mall, the heart of their small town. Though some would call it thankless work, John saw it differently. He wasn't there to just patrol the grounds or stare blankly at surveillance screens. He saw himself as a silent protector, a man ensuring everyone could shop, laugh, and live their lives safely. The mall opened at 9 a.m., but John was always there by 7:30. That morning was no different. He arrived dressed in his pressed navy uniform, his sturdy black boots echoing against the tiled floors as he greeted the cleaning crew and a few shop owners unlocking their doors. Outside, the early sun cast soft golden rays over the nearly empty parking lot. "Morning, John," called out Tim, the owner of a small bakery kiosk. "Morning, Tim. Smells good in there already," John replied with a grin. The day began quietly, just as expected. A few regulars trickled in, mothers with toddlers, retirees taking their morning strolls, and teenagers desperate for weekend plans. John made his usual rounds, greeting familiar faces and watching over the crowds with his calm, observant eyes. One face, however, always stood out, Mrs. Reynolds. She was a tiny woman in her late 80s, with silver hair curled neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her frail figure seemed almost lost beneath her oversized coat, but her determination was unmistakable. Every morning, like clockwork, Mrs. Reynolds arrived at the mall. She didn't come to shop. She came to walk. "Doctor's orders," she always said when anyone asked. She had bad knees, a weak heart, and the stubborn spirit of someone who refused to give up. John often watched her shuffle from one end of the mall to the other, her little cane tapping steadily against the floor. He always kept an eye on her, not because she was a bother, but because she reminded him of his own mother, who had passed away years ago. Mrs. Reynolds always stopped to rest near a bench close to the fountain in the center of the plaza. It had become a sort of unspoken routine. John would nod politely as he passed by, and she would smile back in quiet acknowledgement. That morning, though, something felt off. At around 11 a.m., John noticed Mrs. Reynolds standing near the main entrance, peering outside nervously. She was clutching her cane tighter than usual, her other hand fumbling with a small cloth bag hanging from her shoulder. The mall had grown busier by now, shoppers weaving around her as if she were invisible. John paused near the entrance, watching her for a moment before deciding to approach. "Morning, Mrs. Reynolds. Everything okay?" She turned, startled, but quickly managed a smile. "Oh, John, I didn't see you there. Well, I need to get across the street." "Across the street?" John glanced outside through the large glass doors. A busy intersection sat just beyond the parking lot, cars zooming past with little regard for pedestrians. "Why don't you sit for a moment? I'll help you get where you need to go." No, I can manage," she replied stubbornly, though her voice trembled ever so slightly. "I'm supposed to pick up something for my grandson. It won't take long." John hesitated, glancing at his watch. His shift required him to patrol this entrance for another 20 minutes before he could take a break. Still, there was something in the way Mrs. Reynolds gripped her cane, her knuckles white, her lips pressing into a thin line, that tugged at his conscience. "Wait here a second," John said firmly. "Let me make sure you're okay." Without giving her a chance to argue, John stepped outside. The morning sun was now high overhead, beating down on the pavement as the sounds of honking horns filled the air. The intersection was far busier than he expected. Traffic lights changed in rapid succession, leaving little time for anyone, let alone a frail elderly woman, to make it across safely. John returned and gave Mrs. Reynolds a kind but no-nonsense look. "Let me walk you across. It's not safe." She started to protest, but something in his tone told her he wouldn't back down. Reluctantly, she allowed him to take her arm as they moved toward the parking lot. It seemed so simple, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, crossing a street. But as they stepped into the crosswalk, time seemed to slow. John kept his steps measured, his hand hovering near Mrs. Reynolds to steady her as needed. The light was green, and cars had stopped, but the impatience in their rumbling engines was palpable. John ignored it. They were halfway across when it happened. A blaring horn ripped through the air, followed by the screeching of tires. John whipped his head to the left and saw it, a black sedan barreling through the intersection, completely ignoring the red light. For a split second, he froze, instincts warring with logic. Mrs. Reynolds had stopped too, frozen like a statue as the car bore down on them. John acted without thinking. He grabbed Mrs. Reynolds by the arm, pulling her forward with all his strength, practically carrying her as he dove toward the opposite curb. The car zoomed past just inches behind them, the wind whipping at their clothes as it skidded to a halt several yards down the road. For a moment, there was silence. John's heart thundered in his chest as he looked at Mrs. Reynolds, who sat trembling on the grass, tears streaming down her face. She clutched his arm, her voice shaking. "You saved me, John. You saved me." People began to gather, a few from the mall and others from nearby shops, staring in shock at the near tragedy. Someone shouted at the driver, who sped off before anyone could get a license plate. John barely registered it, his focus still on Mrs. Reynolds. "It's okay," he said softly, helping her sit upright. "You're okay now." But as the crowd thickened, a voice cut through the murmurs, a voice John recognized. "John." He turned to see his supervisor, Mr. Gibbons, marching toward him with a scowl so deep it could carve stone. He was a wiry man in his late 50s, with a sharp jawline and a perpetual frown that seemed glued to his face. "What do you think you're doing?" Gibbons snapped, his eyes darting from John to Mrs. Reynolds to the growing crowd. "You're supposed to be at your post." John stood slowly, still holding Mrs. Reynolds steady. "She needed help. I couldn't just." "I don't care." Gibbons interrupted, his voice rising. "Your job is to stay at your station. You can't abandon it for any reason, do you hear me?" "She would have been hit by that car," John said, his voice tight with frustration. "I did what anyone would have done." Gibbons sneered, unimpressed. "You left your post. That's negligence, Harris, and I won't tolerate it. We'll discuss this in my office. Now." John glanced at Mrs. Reynolds, who was staring up at Gibbons with disbelief. "He saved my life," she said, her voice cracking. "How can you speak to him like that?" Gibbons ignored her, his gaze locked on John. "Now, Harris." The crowd murmured in disapproval as John reluctantly turned to follow his supervisor back toward the mall. Whispers filled the air, shoppers exchanging looks of disbelief and anger. John felt the weight of 100 eyes on his back, but he kept his head held high. Inside the office, Gibbons slammed the door shut behind them. "You're fired," he said coldly. John blinked. "What?" "You heard me. You're done here, Harris. Collect your things and leave." "You're punishing me for helping someone?" John asked, his voice rising. "I'm enforcing the rules," Gibbons replied, his tone unyielding. "Rules keep this place running. You broke them. End of story." John stared at him, his mind reeling. He had spent years working at this mall, doing his job with care and integrity. And now, because of one John Harris stepped out of the mall with a heaviness he hadn't felt in years. The automatic doors hissed shut behind him, cutting off the faint murmurs and whispers of those who had witnessed the scene. The spring sun hung high in the sky, bright and blinding, yet it seemed to cast a shadow over him, a weight far heavier than his modest security guard badge. He stood still for a moment, his breath shaky as he absorbed what had just happened. Fired. For helping someone. He glanced toward the far end of the parking lot, where Mrs. Reynolds now sat on a low concrete bench, her frail figure bent forward as she caught her breath. A few other mallgoers had gathered around her, their hushed voices carrying faint traces of outrage. She could have been killed. He saved her life. What kind of boss fires someone for that? That supervisor's a monster. John gripped the sides of his belt tightly, his knuckles white, before loosening his fists and forcing himself to move. He took long, steady strides toward Mrs. Reynolds. When he reached her, her watery eyes turned up to meet his, their usual twinkle now replaced by anguish and shame. "John," she began, her voice cracking like an old record. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want this for you." "Don't worry about me, Mrs. Reynolds," he said softly, kneeling down beside her. "Are you all right? Did you get hurt?" "No, dear. You were my angel out there," she replied, her gnarled hand trembling as she placed it over his forearm. "But they shouldn't have done that to you. I'll make this right. I swear I will." John smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't owe me anything. I did what I had to do." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her frail shoulders rising and falling with frustration. "This town, this world, it's all wrong. Good men shouldn't be punished for doing good things, CT of kindness, it was all gone." "Fine," John said finally, his voice low but steady. "I'll leave." He turned and walked out, his steps slow and deliberate. As he stepped back into the mall, shoppers stopped and stared. He avoided their gazes, his jaw set tight. But just as he reached the exit, a voice rang out behind him, Mrs. Reynolds. "I'll make this right, John," she called, tears in her eyes. John didn't know how to respond. Instead, he patted her hand gently before rising to his feet. He glanced toward the mall one last time. Through the glass, he saw Gibbons standing inside, watching him like a hawk, smug satisfaction etched on his face. It sent a chill down John's spine, a reminder of just how little control he had over his fate in that moment. A man like Gibbons, who lived by rules and punishments, would never understand. As John trudged back to his car, the events of the past half hour replayed in his mind on an endless loop. It had all happened so fast. One moment, he was a man with a stable, if modest, job. The next, he was unemployed with a family to support. Bills were already piling up at home, the roof needed repairs, and his daughter Sophie's school fees were due at the end of the month. A man like him couldn't afford to lose his job. Yet, as he gripped the steering wheel and stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he found it hard to regret what he'd done. Would he have acted any differently? Could he have watched Mrs. Reynolds struggle and done nothing? No. That wasn't who John Harris was. The drive home was long, though his little house sat only 10 minutes from the mall. As he pulled into the driveway, his wife Emily appeared in the doorway, her brow furrowed with concern. She must have seen the look on his face because she stepped forward before he even got out of the car. "John?" she asked softly, meeting him as he walked up the steps. "What happened?" He sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. It's a long story. I lost my job." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Why? What happened?" He hesitated, then recounted everything, the crosswalk, Mrs. Reynolds, the car, Gibbons, the firing. By the time he finished, Emily's expression had morphed from confusion to anger to something softer, concern laced with pride. She reached out, taking his hand. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. I don't care what anyone says. You saved someone's life. But I lost everything, John muttered, staring down at the worn wooden steps. We can't afford this, Em. How am I supposed to fix this? Emily squeezed his hand. We'll figure it out. You're a good man, John Harris. Something good will come from this. I know it will. John didn't share her optimism. That night, as the family sat around the dinner table, the silence was almost unbearable. Their daughter, Sophie, sensed something was wrong and kept glancing between her parents. Is everything okay, Daddy? She finally asked. Everything's fine, sweetheart, John replied, forcing a smile he didn't feel. Eat up. You've got a big day at school tomorrow. But later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, John lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. Could he get another job? Maybe. Would anyone hire him quickly enough to cover their bills? Probably not. The next morning, a knock at the door startled him as he sat at the kitchen table, sipping his now lukewarm coffee. He opened the door to find Mrs. Reynolds standing there, a small package in her hands. Mrs. Reynolds, he said, surprised. What are you doing here? She smiled weakly. I wanted to check on you, dear. I couldn't sleep last night, thinking about everything that happened. I spoke to some people, friends of mine who still have connections in this town. I told them your story. John frowned, unsure where she was going with this. You didn't need to do that. Yes, I did. She extended the small package toward him. It's not much, but I want you to have this. John hesitated before taking it. Inside was an envelope, cash. Not a fortune, but enough to help them for a week or two. I can't take this, Mrs. Reynolds, John said, holding it back out to her. You'll do no such thing, she said firmly, her voice carrying an unexpected strength. Consider it a thank you. And you'll be hearing from others soon. People are starting to talk about what happened. You're a hero, John Harris, whether you like it or not. After she left, John sat down heavily on the couch, the envelope in his lap. He didn't feel like a hero, just a man caught in an impossible situation. But Mrs. Reynolds' words stuck with him. People are starting to talk. And indeed, they were. By the afternoon, John's phone buzzed with a call from Tim, the bakery owner at the mall. John, you won't believe this, Tim said, his voice full of excitement. Your story's all over the local news. People are furious. There's even talk of organizing a protest to get you your job back. John blinked, stunned. What? How? I don't know, man. Word travels fast in a town like ours. Just thought you should know, you've got people on your side. John hung up the phone and let out a slow breath. He hadn't expected any of this. All he'd done was help an old woman cross the street. Now, suddenly, his name was on everyone's lips. He didn't know what to make of it, whether to feel hopeful or wary. But that was just the beginning. 2 days later, a black luxury car rolled up to his house and parked quietly along the curb. John watched through the window, his brow furrowing as a tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out. The stranger approached the door with a confidence that didn't match the quiet suburban neighborhood. When John opened the door, the man extended his hand with a smile. John Harris? Yes? John replied cautiously, shaking the man's hand. My name is Bennett, the man said. You don't know me, but I know you. I heard about what you did for Mrs. Reynolds, and I think we need to talk. John stared at him, stunned. Why? The man's smile widened, but there was something mysterious in his gaze. Because sometimes good men deserve a second chance. And I think I have something you'll want to hear. In that moment, John didn't know it yet, but his life was about to take an unexpected turn, One he never could have imagined. John Harris stood at the threshold of his modest home, staring at the man who called himself Bennett. Everything about the stranger was polished, the charcoal suit tailored to perfection, his black leather shoes catching the sunlight, and the faint scent of an expensive cologne that lingered in the air. John couldn't help but feel like an intruder had stepped into his simple life, an emissary from a world that didn't often cross paths with men like him. "I'm sorry," John said, his tone guarded, "but I don't understand why you're here. How do you know about me?" Bennett smiled, the kind of smile that held both warmth and mystery. "Word gets around in towns like this, John. It doesn't take long for a story as remarkable as yours to travel. But let's not talk out here." He gestured toward the house. "May I come in?" John hesitated. The man's presence felt surreal, almost too neat to be trusted. Yet something about Bennett's demeanor, calm, collected, and somehow sincere, urged him to step aside. "Sure," John said, moving back to let him in. Emily, who'd been wiping down the kitchen counters, appeared in the doorway, startled by the sight of the sharply dressed man standing in their modest living room. She glanced at John with a silent question in her eyes. "Emily," John said, gesturing toward their guest, "this is Mr. Bennett. He wanted to speak with me." Bennett nodded respectfully to her. "It's a pleasure, ma'am. You have a lovely home." Emily gave him a polite smile, though her wariness matched John's. "Thank you." Bennett motioned toward the couch. "Please, sit. This won't take long." John sat down slowly, his muscles stiff with unease. Emily remained nearby, leaning against the doorframe as she folded her arms across her chest. Bennett took a seat in the armchair across from them, his movements measured and deliberate. "Let me start by saying this, John," Bennett began, his voice smooth but serious. "You did something extraordinary. You acted when most people wouldn't have. You saved Mrs. Reynolds' life, but instead of being celebrated, you were punished. That's unjust, to say the least." John frowned slightly. "It wasn't about being a hero. She needed help. I just did what anyone would have done." Bennett chuckled softly, though there was no mockery in it. "I disagree. Most people wouldn't have risked their jobs, let alone their lives, to help a stranger. But you did. And that's why I'm here." John exchanged a glance with Emily, who looked as confused as he felt. "What do you mean?" Bennett leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I'm a businessman, John. I've made my success by spotting potential in people and opportunities. But I wasn't always successful. I grew up in a town much like this one, in a family that worked hard and lived paycheck to paycheck. My father taught me two things: hard work and integrity. Those are values I've carried with me my entire life, and when I hear about men like you, men who embody those values, I feel it's my responsibility to help." John shifted uncomfortably. "Help how?" Bennett smiled again, this time with a hint of excitement. "I run a charitable foundation, John. It's not something I advertise because I don't do it for the attention. But I invest in people, good people, who've fallen on hard times. I want to offer you a job." John blinked, stunned. "A job?" "Yes. It won't be easy, but I think it'll suit you perfectly. I oversee several programs focused on community outreach, helping veterans, supporting the elderly, and providing job training for struggling families. You would be working as a coordinator in one of these programs, right here in your town. It's a position that requires trust, leadership, and compassion, qualities you've already proven you have." John's jaw tightened. This felt like a dream, too good to be true. "Why me? I don't have any special qualifications. I'm just a security guard." Bennett shook his head. "You're more than that, John. You're someone who does what's right, no matter the cost. That's rare. And besides," he smiled faintly, You saved someone I care about. John's brow furrowed. Mrs. Reynolds? Bennett nodded. She's an old friend of the family. I heard about what happened through her, and when I read the news, I knew I couldn't ignore it. John sat back, overwhelmed. He could feel Emily's gaze on him, searching his face for answers. I don't know what to say, John admitted. Say yes, Bennett replied simply. I know this is a lot to take in, but think it over. I can assure you the pay will more than cover your needs, and the work will mean something. You'll be making a difference. John rubbed the back of his neck, trying to process it all. And if I say no? Bennett smiled faintly. Then I respect your decision, and we part ways here. No strings attached. But I think you'll regret passing up the chance to change your life, and the lives of others. The room fell silent. John felt Emily step closer, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He looked up at her, searching for any hint of doubt in her expression, but there was none. Instead, her eyes were steady and filled with quiet encouragement. What do you think, Em? John asked softly. She gave him a small smile. I think you should consider it. Maybe this happened for a reason. John let out a slow breath, his mind racing. Finally, he looked back at Bennett. Okay. I'll give it a shot. Bennett grinned, his entire face lighting up. Excellent choice, John. I knew you wouldn't disappoint. The next morning, John found himself standing in front of an old community center at the edge of town. The building was in rough shape, peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, and a sign that hung crookedly over the entrance. Yet there was something about it that felt promising. Hopeful. Bennett was waiting for him by the front door, dressed more casually this time in slacks and a button-down shirt. Welcome to your new office, he said with a smile. John stared at the building. This place looks like it's seen better days. It has, Bennett admitted. But that's why you're here. This center used to be the heart of the community, a place for kids to play, seniors to gather, and families to find support. It's been neglected for years, but I believe it can be restored. I need someone to oversee that transformation. John turned to him, surprised. You want me to run this place? With my help, yes, Bennett replied. You'll hire staff, recruit volunteers, and connect with the community. It'll take hard work and dedication, but I have no doubt you're the man for the job. John swallowed, the weight of the opportunity settling in. He'd never imagined himself leading something so important, yet here he was, standing on the threshold of something far bigger than himself. I don't know where to start, he admitted. Bennett clapped a hand on his shoulder. One step at a time, John. Just like you crossed that street. John let out a small, disbelieving laugh. For the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done surprising him yet. And little did he know, the surprises were far from over. The air inside the community center was stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and forgotten memories. The hardwood floors creaked beneath John Harris's boots as he walked through the main hall, its walls covered in faded paint and remnants of old posters announcing long-forgotten events, family game night, and senior yoga class every Thursday. Sunlight streamed in through cracked windows, revealing a large room littered with broken chairs, abandoned tables, and a scattering of deflated basketballs shoved in the corner. John stopped and rubbed his neck, taking in the sheer amount of work that lay ahead. He had never run a program like this before. Security guard work had been simple: keep watch, stay on your feet, protect people. This was different. This was building something. Rebuilding a place where lives could intersect, where people could come for comfort, help, and hope. Looks like a hurricane rolled through here, John muttered aloud. Behind him, Bennett entered, his polished shoes clacking softly against the wood. It's been sitting like this for almost 5 years. After the last administrator left, funding dried up, and the place was forgotten. A shame, really. It used to bring so much life to this town. John turned to him, eyebrows furrowed. Why me? There have to be people more qualified to run something like this. Bennett smiled knowingly, walking further into the room. Because it's not about qualifications, John. It's about heart. Paper resumes don't fix buildings. They don't inspire communities. People do. I saw what kind of man you are. That's enough for me. John shook his head with a quiet sigh. He wasn't used to this kind of confidence in him, let alone from someone as powerful as Bennett. I'll do what I can. But it's gonna take time. Time, resources, and effort, Bennett agreed. And you won't do it alone. I've arranged for some initial funding to get you started, repairs, supplies, outreach. From there, you'll decide what the center needs and how to get the community involved. John's heart beat faster. Funding. It wasn't something he'd expected, and it suddenly made this real in a way that shook him. This wasn't just a test. This was a chance, one that he couldn't afford to fail. Over the next few days, John threw himself into the work. He started small, creating lists of what needed immediate attention, fixing broken plumbing, replacing windows, and clearing out junk. Bennett sent contractors to assess the structural damage, and John worked alongside them, hauling out old furniture, scrubbing graffiti-stained walls, and sweeping dust so thick it choked the air. His hands were blistered by the end of the first week, his muscles sore, but something inside him felt alive. Every chair he fixed and every room he cleaned was a step towards something meaningful. Word began to spread around town. At first, people seemed hesitant, curious, but cautious. John could see it in the way they lingered near the center, peeking through the windows before walking away. But one day, a familiar voice stopped him mid-task. Need a hand there, John? John turned to see Tim, the bakery owner, standing at the front door with a grin. He was holding a tray of pastries, his apron still covered in flour. Tim, John said with surprise. What are you doing here? Brought you something to keep up your strength, Tim said, holding out the tray. And I heard you were fixing up this place. Thought maybe I could help. John blinked, taken aback. Help? Yeah, help. I've got some free time in the mornings. I used to come here as a kid, you know. Played dodgeball in this very room. Figured it's time I gave back. A strange warmth settled in John's chest. I'd appreciate that, Tim. Really. The next day, it was a teenager, Luke, who showed up with a basketball under his arm. You need someone to clean the courts, he asked, his voice soft with hesitation. I kinda miss playing here. Then came Mrs. Sanchez, an elderly woman who offered to teach knitting classes. After that, a father of 3 volunteered to help fix up the playground out back. Day by day, more people came, some with tools in hand, others with ideas for programs, all of them drawn by a sense of purpose and the need to see the center thrive again. John worked alongside them, his hands as dirty as anyone else's. He listened to their stories as they painted walls, hammered nails, and scrubbed floors. He learned that Mrs. Sanchez had lost her husband years ago and had been looking for ways to stay busy. Luke had dropped out of school after his father left, searching for a place to belong. Tim's bakery had nearly closed during hard times, but the community had rallied to save it. The center became a living, breathing thing, filled with laughter, sweat, and the steady rhythm of progress. For the first time in years, John saw the town as something more than a collection of strangers. It was a family, one that had been waiting for the right spark to come together again. But amidst the progress came challenges. One afternoon, John was on a ladder, replacing a flickering light fixture in the main hall when he heard Bennett's voice behind him. John, we need to talk. John climbed down slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. Something wrong? Bennett's face was unusually serious. There's been some pushback from the town council. A few members think the funding for the center is a waste of resources. John's jaw tightened. A waste? How can they say that when they see what's happening here? Not everyone believes in rebuilding what's broken, Bennett replied calmly. They're hosting a council meeting in 3 days to decide whether to continue supporting the project. John felt a cold weight settle in his gut. What happens if they don't? The funding stops, Bennett said simply. But I wouldn't give up hope just yet. This is your chance to show them what this center means to the community. Over the next few days, John barely slept. He met with volunteers, gathering stories of how the center had impacted their lives. He called on families, students, and seniors, urging them to attend the council meeting. He even found himself speaking to the local news station when they arrived to cover the growing buzz. Every word, every plea came from his heart, because he knew what was at stake, not just for himself, but for the town. The night of the council meeting, the room was packed. Rows of chairs were filled with faces John recognized, people who had shown up day after day to rebuild the center. When it was his turn to speak, John stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the podium. I know some of you think this center isn't worth saving, he began, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. But I've spent the last few weeks watching this place come back to life. I've seen teenagers find hope, seniors find purpose, and families find a place to belong. This center isn't just a building, it's a lifeline. He paused, scanning the crowd. You may call it a waste of money, but I call it an investment in our town, our people, and our future. If you shut this place down, you're not just closing a building. You're shutting out the very heart of this community. The room fell silent. For a moment, John thought he'd failed. But then it happened, a slow clap, echoing from the back of the room. It was Tim. Then Luke. Then Mrs. Sanchez. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause, cheers bouncing off the walls. The council voted unanimously to continue the funding. That night, as John stood outside the center, watching the lights glow warmly from inside, Bennett appeared beside him. You did it, John, Bennett said with a proud smile. John looked at him, a faint grin spreading across his face. We did it. In that moment, John realized something profound. Sometimes life tears you down so it can rebuild you into something stronger. He had started this journey as a security guard, ordinary, invisible. But now, he was something else. He was a leader, a builder, a man who had found his purpose in the unlikeliest of places. The glow of the community center's lights spilled out onto the cracked pavement, casting a soft golden hue over the now thriving building. Inside, laughter and conversation hummed in the air. Seniors played chess in the far corner, mothers sipped coffee as their kids darted around the newly polished floors, and teenagers organized a game of basketball in the refurbished gym. The center, once forgotten and lifeless, now pulsed with energy, a beating heart at the center of the town. John Harris stood at the entrance, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket as he watched it all unfold. He hadn't stepped inside yet, choosing instead to savor the moment from a distance. It felt surreal, as if one wrong move might cause it all to vanish. Just months ago, he'd been a man without a job, without direction. Now, he was something he'd never dreamed of, needed. Respected. Lost in thought, are we? The voice startled him from his reverie, and John turned to find Bennett walking toward him with that same confident stride and calm demeanor. The man still looked out of place in his tailored gray coat and sleek black shoes, like someone plucked straight from a world of skyscrapers and corporate boardrooms. Yet here he was again, standing on the cracked steps of an old community center, grinning at John like an old friend. Just taking it all in, John replied, glancing back at the scene inside. Feels like a dream. Bennett's smile softened. Well, you made the dream happen, John. Don't forget that. John shook his head with a quiet laugh. Took a lot more than me. Half the town pitched in. People I never thought I'd meet. That's what happens when you give people a reason to believe again, Bennett said, leaning on the railing. You gave them that reason. John fell silent for a moment. The compliment made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite say why. Something about Bennett, as kind and generous as he'd been, still seemed unknowable. As if there was more to him than the neatly tied story he presented. John had been raised to trust a person's actions over their words, but even so, the businessman's motivations were a question that lingered at the back of his mind. Before he could reply, a group of teenagers burst through the double doors, their breath fogging in the cool night air as they hooped and cheered. One of them, a lanky kid named Luke, spotted John and jogged over with a grin. "Hey, Mr. Harris," Luke called, holding up a worn basketball. "We're running a game in the gym. You should come play. I bet you're still pretty good." John snorted, shaking his head. "Me? Nah. I'd probably throw out my back." Luke laughed. "Come on. You've been working too hard. Take a break for once." John's face softened, and he nodded at the group. "You kids have fun. I'll be watching." As Luke ran back inside, John turned to Bennett. "That kid, he's really turning things around. Couple months ago, he wouldn't say 2 words to me. Now he's here every day." Bennett nodded, his expression contemplative. "That's the power of a place like this. It gives people hope and purpose. Speaking of which..." He pulled something from his coat pocket, an envelope, thick with weight, and held it out to John. "What's this?" John asked, frowning. "Open it," Bennett said simply. John hesitated, then took the envelope and carefully tore it open. Inside, his fingers brushed against crisp documents, legal papers, contracts, and an official-looking deed. His breath caught as he scanned the first page, his mind trying to make sense of the words. "This," John stammered. "This is the deed to the center." Bennett nodded. "It's yours now." John's heart thundered in his chest as he looked up sharply. "Mine? What are you talking about?" "I mean exactly that," Bennett replied. "You've proven you can run this place. You've earned the trust of the community, and you've given them something no one else could. So, I'm stepping back and leaving it to you. The center is yours to manage, grow, and lead however you see fit." John stared at him, stunned. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and impossible. "Why would you do this? Why me?" Bennett's eyes softened, his voice quieter now. "Because I believe in you, John. And because this town needs someone like you, someone who understands what it means to put others first. I have the resources to help, but you're the soul of this place. Without you, none of this would have happened." John swallowed hard, his throat tight as he looked back down at the papers. His hands trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the weight of what they represented. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted quietly. "I've never run anything like this before. What if I mess it up?" "You won't," Bennett said firmly. "You've already proven yourself. And if you ever need help, I'll be here." John let out a shaky breath, the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a job. It was a responsibility, one that could shape the lives of everyone in the town. He had spent years simply existing, never imagining he could be something more. Yet here he was, holding the keys to a future he'd never seen coming. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. John dove headfirst into his new role as the official head of the center, working harder than he ever had before. He scheduled programs for seniors, arranged after-school activities for kids, and started outreach initiatives for families struggling to make ends meet. Word spread like wildfire, and soon the center was bustling at all hours, alive with energy and purpose. The local news returned for another story, and this time, they painted John as a hero, the man who gave a town its heart back. The headlines embarrassed him, but Emily beamed with pride as she watched him give interviews, Sophie clinging to her side and cheering every time his face appeared on TV. "I told you something good would come of this," Emily said one night as they sat on the porch, watching the stars. John smiled faintly, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. "Yeah, you did. You believe it now?" He glanced at her, his expression softening. "I think I'm starting to. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." One quiet afternoon, as John reviewed a new proposal for a teen mentorship program, a knock at his office door made him look up. Bennett stood there, his usual smile replaced by something more somber. "Mind if I come in?" "Of course," John replied, setting the papers aside. "What's wrong?" Bennett closed the door behind him and sank into the chair opposite John. For the first time since they'd met, the businessman looked tired, as if carrying a burden too heavy to bear. "I need to tell you something," Bennett began slowly. "Something I should have told you sooner." John frowned, his stomach twisting with unease. "What is it?" Bennett took a deep breath. "The day you saved Mrs. Reynolds, you saved someone more important than you knew. Mrs. Reynolds isn't just an old family friend. She's my mother." John froze, the words hitting him like a freight train. "Your mother?" Bennett nodded. "She didn't want you to know. She wanted you to help her out of the goodness of your heart, not because of who she is, or who I am. But she told me everything about you, John. Your kindness. Your integrity. That's why I came to you." John sat back, stunned. The pieces clicked into place, Bennett's interest, his generosity, his insistence that John was special. It all made sense now. "I don't know what to say," John muttered. "Don't say anything," Bennett replied. "Just know this, you've earned everything you've been given. My mother's life means everything to me, and because of you, she's still here. This center, this opportunity, it's my way of saying thank you." John looked at him, his heart full. "I didn't do it for a reward, Bennett." "I know," Bennett said quietly. "That's what makes you the right man for this job." As Bennett rose to leave, John sat in silence, absorbing everything he'd just learned. He glanced out the window at the bustling community center, his chest swelling with pride. He hadn't just saved one life that day, he'd saved many. And in doing so, he'd found his own. John leaned back in his chair, the weight of his journey settling into him. Life had tested him, torn him down, and rebuilt him into something stronger. He had started as a security guard, an invisible man. But now, he was a pillar of hope in a community that had needed it most. And for the first time, he knew exactly where he belonged. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched into months. Under John's leadership, the community center blossomed into a haven for the town. What was once a hollow, crumbling building had become a sanctuary of life, hope, and connection. Programs ran day and night, morning yoga for seniors, cooking classes for single mothers, tutoring sessions for struggling kids, and weekend basketball tournaments that drew crowds larger than John had ever seen. The sound of laughter had replaced the silence. Where there had been decay, there was now color. Bright murals painted by local artists adorned the walls, depicting scenes of unity, children playing, hands reaching out, families together. The playground out back was alive with squealing kids racing each other on swings and slides, and inside, the hum of activity echoed through every hall. It was everything John had dreamed it could be and more. One afternoon, John sat on a bench near the refurbished playground, a rare moment of rest as he sipped his coffee and watched Sophie climb the monkey bars alongside a group of other kids. The sight brought a smile to his face. He'd spent so many nights worrying about his little girl and whether he was doing enough for her. Now, watching her laugh and play surrounded by friends, John felt something he hadn't known in years: peace. "Looks like the place is holding up well," a familiar voice said, pulling him from his thoughts. John turned to see Bennett approaching, hands tucked into his overcoat pockets, his eyes scanning the busy playground. The businessman still carried that same aura of quiet confidence, but today there was something softer in his expression. "It's better than holding up," John replied, grinning. "You should have seen the turnout last weekend. We had over 100 people here for the family movie night. It was packed." Bennett smiled faintly and nodded. "You've done good work, John. More than I ever expected." John looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without you. None of this would have happened without your help." Bennett shook his head. "No, John. I just gave you the resources. You're the one who put your heart into this place. You're the reason it's thriving." The words stirred something in John, a mix of gratitude and quiet pride. He looked around the center, watching families come and go, neighbors chatting, kids racing past them. A year ago, none of this had seemed possible. He had been just another man trying to make ends meet, invisible to the world. Now, he was part of something larger than himself, a foundation that would stand long after he was gone. "Bennett," John said after a moment, "why did you really help me? You didn't have to. A lot of people would have just moved on." Bennett paused, his gaze fixed on the playground, as if carefully choosing his words. "You remind me of my father, John," he said quietly. "He was a man like you, honest, hard-working, a little rough around the edges, but always putting others first. He ran a small hardware store back in our town. He helped people who couldn't afford to pay, gave them credit when no one else would. I never understood it as a kid. I thought he was being foolish, giving away what little we had. Years later, after he passed, I came back to the town and saw the impact he'd made. People told me stories about how he'd kept their families afloat, how he'd given them hope when they needed it most. It hit me then, my father hadn't been foolish at all. He'd been building something bigger than himself." Bennett turned to John, his eyes softening. "That's what you're doing here. When you stepped in to help Mrs. Reynolds, you weren't thinking about the cost. You were doing what was right. That's rare, John. Too rare." John swallowed hard, the word striking a deep chord within him. He looked away, his gaze falling back on the playground. He'd spent so much of his life believing he was just one man, incapable of changing the world. But now, he understood something Bennett's father must have known, too: sometimes all it takes is one person willing to act. Before Bennett could say more, a commotion from the parking lot caught their attention. A group of teenagers stood huddled around something, their voices growing louder by the second. John frowned, standing up. "What's going on over there?" Bennett followed him as they walked toward the scene. As they got closer, John spotted Luke at the center of the group, holding something small and shivering in his hands. "It's a puppy," Luke called, looking up at John with wide eyes. "We found her under that old truck. She's hurt." John knelt down, taking a closer look. The puppy, small, scrawny, and covered in dirt, looked up at him with trembling eyes, one of its paws curled protectively against its chest. "She must have been abandoned," Luke said, his voice soft with concern. "What do we do?" John sighed, looking at the poor creature. It was a question he'd asked himself many times: what do you do when something fragile, broken, and forgotten is left in your hands? He glanced at the kids surrounding him, their faces expectant, their eyes reflecting the same hope he'd seen when they first walked through the community center doors. "We take care of her," John said simply. "That's what we do." The kids erupted into cheers as John carefully took the puppy into his arms, cradling it against his chest. "Looks like you've got another member of the center," Bennett remarked with a grin. "Yeah," John replied, his voice warm. "She'll fit right in." That night, as John sat in his living room with the little puppy curled up beside him, Sophie tiptoed in and knelt by his chair. She reached out to gently stroke the dog's fur, her face full of wonder. "What's her name, Daddy?" John looked at the puppy, thinking for a moment before answering. "Hope." Sophie beamed. "I like that. She's lucky you found her." John smiled softly. "Sometimes we don't find them, sophomore. Sometimes they find us." The words hung in the air, heavier than he'd intended. He looked down at the little creature sleeping peacefully, then back at his daughter, who was still smiling as if the world had nothing wrong in it. In that moment, John felt a quiet clarity, a sense that everything he'd endured, every twist and turn that had brought him here, had been for a reason. It wasn't just about fixing buildings or creating programs. It was about what those things represented: second chances, new beginnings, and hope for the ones who'd been forgotten. Months later, a plaque was unveiled at the entrance of the center during a town-wide celebration. Carved into the bronze surface were simple words: Harris Community Center, a place of hope for all. John stood beside the plaque, surrounded by Emily, Sophie, Bennett, and the crowd of people who had made the center's success possible. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting everything in a golden glow as families laughed, children played, and neighbors embraced. It was a scene John would carry with him for the rest of his life. As Bennett stepped forward to say a few words, he gestured toward John. "We all know John Harris as a man who stepped up when no one else would. A man who did the right thing, no matter the cost. Today, we celebrate not just this center, but the values that built it: kindness, courage, and community. John, this is your legacy. Thank you." The crowd erupted into applause, but John just shook his head, overwhelmed. He stepped to the podium, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I didn't do this alone," he said, looking out over the sea of faces. "Every one of you helped build this. This isn't my legacy, it's ours. It's proof that when good people come together, we can change the world, one act of kindness at a time." He paused, letting the words settle before adding, "So I'll leave you with this: when the moment comes, when someone needs you, don't hesitate. Do what's right, even if it's hard. Because you never know how far one small act can go." As he stepped down from the podium, John felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. The applause roared in his ears, but it wasn't for him, it was for the community. For what they had built. For hope. And for the first time, he understood that sometimes extraordinary things happen to ordinary people. Not because they were looking for greatness, but because they were brave enough to do the right thing, no matter the cost. That's how lives changed. That's how towns came back to life. And that's how legacies were made.